everyone. Welcome to today's installment of Historical Analogies. This is the second lecture in our series. It's actually the first one if we don't count the introductory lecture. But yes, today we're going to be talking about a very interesting connection between Romanesque style and the Neoclassical style, or an era, if you will. We'll eventually discuss the difference between a style, stylistical formation, and an era, or a given period in history of art. Now, this is obviously something that goes beyond the history of art as such. We are talking about the period of a society that has defined politics, literature, of course, visual arts, which is what we're talking about, and many other things. So we are truly talking about two pivotal, I would say, eras in European history, which is the reason why I've decided to begin with them, and which is the reason why I've decided to make these two come together. They have many, many similarities, which may come as a surprise to someone who is more or less well acquainted with both of these styles. Should like to start with the fact that we tend to see these two styles as profoundly different, because we see neoclassical style as the pinnacle of European painting when it comes to technicity, when it comes to skill, aesthetics, many different aspects. We see very much neoclassical style as the very height of what European painters were able to produce. If we say that there is a certain development, this is a rather common trope and a rather common opinion that I tend to thoroughly deconstruct as this course progresses. We think that there is growth in skill, in sophistication, in elegance that is quite linear and that goes between Romanesque to neoclassical styles. So we say that the paintings become not only paintings but drawings, arguably buildings. They become better and better, more complex, more sophisticated, more elaborate. So there is a strong up curve that goes from one to the other. And this is another way of looking at it. We need to basically be more precise about what we're talking about here when we're talking about Neoclassicism. So it is in fact a style that begins in the late 18th century. It starts from Italy but then spreads all over Europe and has very, very strong presence in, let's say, France, but also England, also Germany. I would say that Italy and France are probably the most famous strongholds of neoclassicism. Though if you think about neoclassical architecture, you can find a lot of it in the United States of America. You can find it to be a very, very important presence there. If you go to Washington, D.C., for example, you see that that entire city is more or less neoclassical, or at least most important aspects of it, the National Mall and everything around it. So we can say that neoclassicism, what I wanted to be precise about, is a style that begins in the late 18th century, second half of the 18th century, and lasts up until middle of the 20th century. So this is the first thing that may sound somewhat controversial, because we tend to think that neoclassicism lasts up until the, let's say, late 19th, at best early 20th century. And we know that when we get to talk about Impressionism, when we get to talk about modern art, pre-Impressionism, Impressionism, that in the regular view of things, we like to think that Impressionism comes after Neoclassicism. This is entirely false. It does not. Impressionism happens alongside with Neoclassicism. And if we go back to this particular era, we understand that Impressionists were contemporary to a lot of neoclassical painters. They were actually the underground movement of their particular time. So we could say that Impressionism was not seen as mainstream art when it happened. Neoclassicism was mainstream art. Neoclassical painters were the ones winning all the prizes and selling most of their paintings at the Salon, a very important institution back in the day in Paris, France. So it was only in the beginning of the 20th century where Impressionism started slowly being integrated into the cultural and artistic mainstream, and it was really only after World War II, arguably around the 80s of the 20th century, which is very late to the game, that we fully started appreciating Impressionism and that we started connecting it to its particular era where it came from. So nowadays we tend to connect Impressionism to the second half of the 19th century, let's say from 70s of the 19th century onwards. But if we were to go back to that particular period, we would understand that Neoclassicism was the mainstream art of that time. And this is really important for what we're going to be talking about here. This is really important for the connection that Neoclassicism has to Romanesque art. Because, as we said, Neoclassicism was all about skill, refinement, drawing, clarity, sophistication, etc. The thing we want to address now is, I would say, the leitmotif of this entire series, something that we're going to go back to pretty much at every lecture that we take, at every analogy that we make. And this is the connection between the old and the new. Something we've addressed in the previous introductory lecture, where we spoke about old always being present in the new. We took Old and New Testament as examples, Old Testament being much larger than the New, and that we have this idea that when we are engaged in creating a new era, a new stylistical formation, a new period, whichever that we create that is new, there is always a leaning back to something that already exists. We always go back to something that already happened in the past. And that something that already happened, this is very poorly worded, but what can we do, is much larger and more important and runs much deeper than whatever is that we are creating anew. So this is again the connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament, not to speak of their importance. I'm just talking about sheer volume. Old Testament is roughly 4 times larger than the new one. It may be even more than that. It doesn't really matter. It's visibly larger than the new one. So when we're talking about Romanesque style and how it relates to Neoclassicism, they both have the same situation happening. So we have this idea that Romanesque style, as the very name suggests, has to do with Rome, because the very name is indicative of this. Romanesque is something like Roman. It comes out of Roman style, and it's something that is a development of the Roman style, but rather it's an evocation of the Roman style. So this is the very title, Romanesque. If we are talking about Neoclassicism, we can say that the very meaning of the term, if we are to take it apart, is classicism anew. So classicism again, if you will. Now, if we were to talk about classicism in itself, it's a French reaction to Baroque that came from Italy. We're going to get to that discussion. It's a very interesting one. There's a lot to be said on the topic. However, the point is that the point of classicism was to go back to the values of classical antiquity, hence the name, and to be very much inspired by, again, Rome. So you could say that Neoclassicism is doing the same thing anew. So we have the fact that Romanesque art goes back to Rome, Neoclassical art goes back to Rome. And when it comes to Neoclassicism, this is all the more interesting, because it not only happens in art, this idea that we need to go back to Rome, it happens in politics, arguably even more so than it does in art, and arguably more importantly and with much larger consequences. Because if we are talking about Neoclassicism in France, which I think is the most important Neoclassicism to talk about, and I'll explain why in a minute, we are truly talking about art that defined the French Revolution. We are talking about painters like David, who was the official painter of the French Revolution, who's created some phenomenal works of art that basically encapsulate the spirit of the French Revolution. So we are truly talking about the very, very important political dimension of this. And the whole political idea of the French and American Revolution, which is nowhere less important, was to bring back the Roman Republic. This is very simple. And this is something you can see in the symbols that they use, in the creation of the state, the fact that they created the Senate. Senate was a Roman institution. The fact that they literally wore themselves, they saw themselves as Romans. Let's say that one of the titles that Napoleon acquired for himself and that he non-ironically used before becoming an emperor was the Consul of Rome, while he was all the time in France. So connection between the French Revolution and Rome, Roman Republic, and entire Roman context is very, very deep and important, and something that we cannot exhaust passing through it like we are doing now. So this is something to be talked about. These are just some of the facts that are thrown together in this particular context for the purposes of this lecture. What I want to go back to is the difference. Now we have this major similarity that both Romanesque style goes back to Rome, both neoclassical style goes back to Rome. There's, however, a very important difference to be addressed, and this difference will help us understand the difference between visual presentation, between the visual aspects of these two styles. We are going to spend most of this lecture talking about similarities, but we need to address some of the differences as well. So the main difference is to which part of Rome we want to communicate to. So when we're talking about the Romanesque style, we are truly talking about the development of Roman Republic that led us to the Roman Empire, and we are talking about the late stages of Roman Empire when Roman emperors saw themselves more and more, increasingly, as gods, as divine figures. And this idea that Roman emperor is a god is very important. So this is something that informed the entire style. If we ever wondered how come that in Rome, in Greece as well as in Rome, we had these amazingly well done statues with great detail, with great veracity, with great dynamism, so truly amongst the pinnacles of Western art, then through mysterious development we got to very minimalist statues and drawings and paintings. We got to something that looks like it was made by a child, that had nowhere near the amount of detail, that was not very true to life, that was not very realistic. It looked actually very, very stylized in a rudimentary direction. So how did we lose this amazing skill to create realistic, complex sculptures and paintings? It really has a lot to do with how we saw Roman emperors, with statues of Roman emperors becoming more and more godlike, meaning more and more abstract. So this whole idea of the Roman emperor being, let's assume this, if we are to be historically correct, just a regular human being, they started depicting Roman emperors more and more as divine, more and more separated from the material realm of existence, if you will. And this also had to do with development of Christianity, with the fact that Christianity was no longer banned, Christians were no longer persecuted in the Roman Empire. In fact, it became the religion of the Roman Empire at one certain moment. And then with development of Christianity, with development of the Roman Emperor as the key figure of Christianity, we had style not necessarily degrade. I would personally not use this term. I would not see it like this, not even aesthetically, but evolve in a particular direction. I would say style becoming more and more abstract and more removed from material reality. For me, this is the right way to talk about this. This is the right way to observe it. So when we're talking about Romanesque style, we're truly talking about this idea that art that we are observing is communicating divinity. And this is not necessarily the case when it comes to Neoclassicism, because most of it is profoundly secular. Neoclassicism comes as a very logical development of the Enlightenment era, and it really much drives and carries the ideas of the Enlightenment, amongst these ideas, I would say secularism, or as they call it in France, laïcité, is very, very important, if not the most important. We could argue that kernel and key of Neoclassicism, philosophically speaking, and ideologically speaking, too, is this idea that we are not to be ruled by divinely appointed kings, we are not to be ruled by divine entities, we are to be ruled by ourselves. So we could say that the philosophy of liberalism and classical liberalism have a lot to do with this. And these philosophies, these philosophical concepts were translated to images. And we can say that the Rome these people wanted to go back to, the American and the French revolutionaries, was not the Rome of late empire, when emperors were increasingly seen more and more as gods. No, this was the Rome of the Republic. Now, this Rome was not by any conceivable means secular, but this is something that they chose to omit for their political goals. So we could say that this would be the main difference, but within this difference, we also have a lot of similarities, because we see this in works of art as we know it from history, that Napoleon, arguably the pinnacle of the French Revolution and a very important historical person, presented himself as God. He presented himself as Jesus Christ. We have many different paintings that attest this. The most famous one would certainly be the coronation of Napoleon in the Louvre Museum done by David, where Napoleon crowns himself. And this is a very curious situation where we have a person crowning themselves, because this is not how you usually do it. Usually you're crowned by the Pope. And when a Pope crowns you, he's showing that he is investing divine authority in you. So Pope is representative of God. He is the speaker of God, if you will, God's ambassador on earth in this material realm. So Pope is usually the only person that can give a crown to a king or to an emperor. Well, Napoleon would not have any of this. He says, I am a self-made man, I take my power, I take my crown, and he crowns himself in the presence of the Pope. We may get to talk about this image, about this painting. It's a very, very interesting work of art. It has a lot to do with coronation of Charlemagne. It has a lot to do with the scandal that was the coronation of Charlemagne, the reaction it provoked in the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, that is, etc. But for the moment, we can say that Napoleon did divinize himself in a way. He acquired this very peculiar, this very oxymoronical, if you will, or almost absurd role of a secular emperor, because he truly saw himself as the Roman emperor. If you're looking at this painting, Coronation of Napoleon, you can see him literally dressed as the Roman emperor. You can see him wearing a toga. And you can see this all over the city of Paris. For, let's say, the statue of Napoleon in Triumphal Arch at the top of the Champs-Élysées depicts him literally wearing a toga. Like, he saw himself as the Roman emperor. He wasn't kidding about this. In his mind, he truly was one. You can see him vested in the same way on the top of the column of Austerlitz at Place Vendôme. So he is again wearing a toga. If you go to the tomb of Napoleon at Invalides, Dôme des Invalides, you can see many different reliefs depicting important stages of Napoleon's rule, laws he's passed, decisions he's made, etc. Again, wearing a toga, like literally depicted as the Roman emperor. But not to get too far into that, this actually turned out to be more of a similarity than a difference. As I was talking through it, I saw that what I wanted to talk about as a difference ended up being a similarity, but all the better for our cause. So let's go back to this whole idea that the Romanesque period, as neoclassical period, is trying to invoke Rome. I would not say mimic Rome, but rather invoke it, rehash, I think would be the most adequate expression. So it is evoking or rehashing Rome in a very peculiar manner, the one that we discussed in the introductory lecture. And this is through fragments. This is through remnants. We have many different empty spots when we are talking about Roman Empire, Roman Republic, or generally Roman culture. Because, as we know, we have destroyed a lot of Roman heritage. Rome was sacked many different times. A lot of the statues were destroyed, some intentionally so by Christians. This is a whole other topic that we may dwell into eventually, that Christians were damaging and destroying statues of antiquity on purpose. They saw them as pagan idols, and they saw them as blasphemous. You don't depict God. God is an abstract notion. It's not to be depicted. There was this whole issue of iconoclasty in the Eastern Roman Empire, where they waged a full-scale civil war, disputing whether they should use images or not. So early Christians were adamantly against this, and they destroyed a lot of statues. This is the reason why most statues from antiquity are damaged. Not because of time, not because of transport, accidental damage. No, this was very much intentionally made. So there is also the fact that we intentionally, not necessarily destroyed, but decomposed or deconstructed a lot of the Roman or Greek buildings, because we needed material to build new Christian buildings. We didn't really have a lot of material back in the day. We didn't have supply chains that the Roman Empire has had, so we had to do with what we had around. And so we've taken stones from many of Roman buildings, amphitheaters, circuses, triumphal arches, prefectorial palaces, forums, basilicas. So we basically deconstructed all of these so as to make new things. And this is really important when we're talking about Romanesque art, because even aesthetically, a lot of Romanesque art invokes this. We can see a presence of Roman materials in some Romanesque churches. We can see them aesthetically being very close to what we saw in Rome. And this takes us back, when we're talking about medieval period, and we're talking about Romanesque period, we are talking about the medieval period, to this idea that medieval period is not properly seen, and it is seen, I would say, often quite falsely, quite wrongly, because we see it from today's perspective, and we're looking at the medieval period, again, not from their own perspective, not how they saw themselves, but we are looking at them how we see them. And we have this very large space from the Renaissance period to today that was in many different cases profoundly and strictly anti-medieval. So we were looking at this period as downright wrong in much about everything. So this particular aspect that I want to be discussing is that we see the medieval period as something profoundly different than what came before it. We divide history of Europe, we divide history of Europe into these three major sections: the antiquity, the medieval period, and modernity. So there is this running joke among historians that I find very funny, yet also very true, that the medieval period started with the fall of the Roman Empire and it ended with the fall of the Roman Empire. So what do they mean by this? It started by the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476, and it ended with the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire that we called Byzantine in 1453. So we have this roughly 1,000 years of something that was in between. This is why we call it the Middle Ages. It's in between antiquity and modernity. So what modernity was all about was bringing back medieval, pre-medieval Roman and Greek ideas. It was bringing back the Roman Republic, Roman aesthetics, but also Greek, not necessarily a republic. They didn't have that. They had polis. They had city-states, so we wanted to bring those back. And we can draw certain analogies between the functioning of Italian city-states in the Renaissance period, places like Florence, very famously, and other ones with Greek city-states of antiquity. So we have this idea that we want to go back to antiquity. We want to take everything we can from antiquity. But this is only partially true. It's much more false than it is true, because when we're looking at medieval period from their own point of view, how they saw themselves, they were doing their best to preserve Roman culture. This is the whole point. The whole purpose, raison d'être of the Catholic Church was to preserve Roman civilization. Not just culture, truly civilization. So this is the reason why Church insisted so much, up until the 20th century actually, on using Latin in their Mass. So this is why we have cathedrals and monasteries being the main centers of learning and of knowledge in European history, because this is how we have universities formed, from monasteries and from cathedrals. And they too spoke Latin. They insisted on Latin. The idea is that the Church truly tried as hard as they could to preserve Roman culture, the culture of antiquity, if you will, because they saw themselves as Roman. We call it the Roman Catholic Church for a very good reason, very obvious reason, because they saw themselves as the continuation of that entire concept. Pope, to this day, non-ironically, carries the title of the Roman Emperor, Pontifex Maximus. This is how we call him, Supreme Pontiff. So Pope himself, with its function, which is the greatest function inside the Catholic Church, really is the Roman Emperor, and there is no joke about this. So this is the whole conflict that we see in that famous neoclassical painting that Napoleon sees himself as the Roman Emperor, and the Pope, Pius VII, in that painting sees himself as the Roman Emperor. So we have two people trying to be Roman Emperor, and this spells trouble. So the idea is that we don't necessarily need to see the church in the medieval period as this great opposition to antiquity. No, they were harnessing and they were collecting and they were basically assembling all of the fragments, anything that was left from antiquity, and they were keeping it together. So this is the same thing as what people in neoclassical period were doing, politically and aesthetically. They wanted their paintings to look as close to Roman examples, Greco-Roman examples, as it was humanly possible. And they saw themselves as being inspired by antiquity. Now, again, I want to go back to this joke that the Roman Empire started with, sorry, not the Roman Empire, that the medieval period started when the Roman Empire fell and ended with the Roman Empire fell. You could say that whatever began with Romanesque style had its pinnacle and had its crescendo, its glorious finale with the neoclassical style. Now, I'm politically talking about the rise of the bourgeoisie. The fact is that when we're talking about the Romanesque period, we're talking about the 11th century. This is when it begins. We are not only talking about European continent being connected, being integrated, and we're not only talking about the first pan-European style, which is Romanesque, we're also talking about the emergence of cities, and cities in a very particular manner as trading units, as trading outposts. So this starts happening, and this starts being a thing, a very politically important thing in the 11th century. In the 12th century, we have universities basically driven by the political pressure from the city class, from the bourgeoisie, to acquire their own education, to have education separated from the clergy. So yeah, not to get into that, that's a whole other topic. But the fact is that the rise of the bourgeoisie arguably starts in the 11th century. Now, this is a very politically charged term. When we say bourgeoisie, this obviously has strong communist implications because it's used in a lot of communist literature. When we are talking about the bourgeoisie, we're talking about the people who live inside cities. Bourg or Burg in Old German means a fortified position, basically a city behind walls. So a burgher in English or a bourgeois in French is someone who lives in a city. And this is how we're talking about this. So we're not, this is not the moment to get into the whole, Marxist or communist explanation. We may get to that, and we will eventually get to that later. For the moment, we're just talking about the bourgeoisie as of people who live in cities, very simply. So we have this becoming a prominent, important political class in the 11th century, and then what happens in the late 18th century with the arrival of neoclassical period is that this political class assumes power through American and then later French Revolution. So this is the turning point in European history, well, Americo-European, transatlantic if you will, because we have this idea that it's no longer monarchies, it's no longer aristocracy, it's the bourgeoisie. They become the politically most important class. And this is truly the world we still live in today. We live in bourgeois, nationalistic nation states, republics in most cases. I mean, we still have some monarchies, but not to get into that, they're not terribly important. So the dominant paradigm of this contemporary era is democratic republic. These are all bourgeois inventions. And they were all inspired by whatever kind of democracies we had back in Greece, and if we had any kind of democracies back in the Roman Republic. So this is the whole very important idea about these two styles, that they are transitional, that they basically attest of the world that is disappearing and at the same time of the world that is being born. And it is really, really important for us to understand them as such, because this is the political, not to say geopolitical, and spiritual and historical insight that helps us decode and properly understand aesthetics of both of these. So we see the Romanesque style basically at the very end of what we very wrongfully call the Dark Ages, and at the very beginning of what we call the High Medieval period. So we know that after Romanesque there's Gothic. Many people see Gothic style, especially in architecture, as the very pinnacle of Western civilization. I happen to be one of those people. I perfectly agree with this. So Romanesque style is opening the door for something truly exceptional. And you could argue that this is politically the case as much as it is aesthetically. With Neoclassicism, we have the same idea. We have neoclassical style, as we already mentioned, be the pinnacle of technical skill, of prowess, of elegance. These paintings truly, again, this may be my subjective opinion, are amongst the finest paintings ever made. We do not have to claim that they're artistically or aesthetically the best, because this is impossible to do, but they are technically, I would say, arguably the best. And not a lot of art historians will argue this. So when it comes to the very painting technique, this is really as far as we were ever able to go. And what neoclassical style is doing is that it's happening at the same time as modern art for a large part of it. So it's opening a door to something also exceptional to modern art and modernity. It's opening the door, politically speaking, to the idea of the republic, of the modern republic. And in terms of economic mode of production, it's opening the door to one of the most important things that has ever happened in history of humanity, the Industrial Revolution. So we're talking about the turn of the century from the 18th to the 19th, but also turn of the century from the 19th to the 20th. We are talking about a world that is industrializing itself, and this changes everything. We'll be going back to the dynamism and difference between these two incredibly important revolutions. One is agricultural, the other one is industrial. I will probably mention this at every given lecture that I go through. They're just that important. There's no way to talk about certain phenomena historically or aesthetically without bringing back one or both of these two revolutions. It is the case that we go back to what I said about Romanesque and Neoclassical. They are in transitional periods. The old world is dying and disappearing. The new world is being born. We have these two styles being very similar in as much they're connecting the two. They're bridges between the old and the new, which also, again, makes us think about the dynamism between the old and the new when we were talking about the Bible and when we were talking about the Iliad, the Odyssey, when we were talking about the Aeneid as well, something we may go back to. Because Aeneid too is written as a bridge between the old world and the new world. It's the bridge between the very politically troubled end of the Roman Republic and then the glorious beginning of the Roman Empire through the rule of Octavian Augustus. So we are talking about transitional periods, and this is seen in aesthetics as much as it's seen in politics. So when we are talking about these two, I've chose them basically because they are the bridge between the political rise and the cultural rise, and then every other aspect of existence of the bourgeois class, or citizens, if you will. Let's try to make it less politically charged. We can say burghers or citizenry. They are not really that pretty as words. So when we were talking about the style itself, perhaps it is exactly because they come in politically very turbulent periods when we are in instability of transition. Transitions are never easy. They're never smooth. They always bring a lot of trouble with them because the old world refuses to die. This is something we've seen many, many times. We see the old elites refusing to leave. They don't want to drop all the privilege they have. They make it an issue. They put up a fight. So we see that this particular style is incredibly simple. It's as if it's the complete inversion of complexities of the world where it came from. So when we're talking about the French Revolution, we are talking about a tremendously complex affair. We are talking about European aristocracy and the church, which may be even more important, losing their foothold and they're losing the power. So we have this new upstart class that is new by their standards, but really that has existed, all along, basically trying to take over. So these are all politically very complex, very violent, very turbulent periods. But in a complete opposition to that, we have the style focused on simplicity, pureness, cleanness, neatness, elegance. We have all these as epithets of both Romanesque style and Neoclassical. Now, we could say arguably that Romanesque style is much more simple than Neoclassicism is. We can, however, say that these are focal points of both of these. When we're talking about Romanesque architecture, we're talking about mostly churches, that are very, very simply done, especially if we compare them to later Gothic style, that is the expansion, that is the elaboration of principles that were brought together by Romanesque style. If we're talking about neoclassical paintings, we are talking about sometimes quite complex compositions, but very pure, very unified, very clean stylization and aesthetization in a way. So we have these being the most important aspects of both Romanesque and Neoclassicism. The simplicity is a very important term here. So we have another analogy to make that grows out of simplicity and that is very, very closely connected to it, that goes back to these different aspects of Rome that we are addressing, and that is the connection with icon. Again, this is a leitmotif of all of these courses that deal with history of art. We'll be going back to icons many, many, many times in modern, in pre-modern, and certainly in medieval times. So we have this aesthetics of the icon. We have the poise, importance, majesty of what is represented in the icon because we are representing divinity. Of course, this makes perfect sense and does not need to be explained further. So when you're dealing with an icon, you're dealing with the window into the, how should we put this, not only divinity, but a different dimension. So you're dealing with something of utmost importance. And we can see that when religious figures are presented in Romanesque style, they are presented in a very bold, strong, impactful, yet incredibly simple and reduced manner. Now, we can say that it's the simplicity of drawing in Romanesque style that invokes importance and divinity and majesty. So the more simple something is in this particular key, the stronger it is. So this is something you can see in, let's say, Art Deco architecture of the 20th century, that you can see very bold pillars, very rhythmical, very organized halls. And it's really the simplicity that instills the sense of awe, not the other way around. It's not the frilly ornamentation that will make you gasp and that will make you feel like you're in the presence of the divine. No, it really is simplicity. So this is the way to understand the aesthetics of the icon as well as to understand the aesthetics of most of these drawings. To a certain extent, most of the churches too. Their architecture, again, is quite simple, and it's the type of simplicity and sternness that invokes admiration rather than anything else. So they both have to do with icons, and this has to do with the fact that we already addressed that some pivotal figures like Napoleon present themselves as divinity. Now, this doesn't only work with Napoleon, it works with the entire idea of a portrait in the neoclassical period, that portraits of many other people around Napoleon, generals, soldiers, etc., are given in this particular key, that they are treated as icons, that there is something truly sublime about them. And this has a lot to do with its particular period. We're going to go back to it more probably when we discuss Romanticism. So when we're looking at the portraits of the great bourgeois, let's say in the Renaissance period, and when we're looking at the portraits of the great bourgeois, the very wealthy people in neoclassical period, but also generals, etc., we're truly looking at them as we would have icons back in the day. So there is this idea that Napoleon represents so well, that we take something that is divine and we bring it down to our earthly realm. So we appropriate divinity in a way and we say we are it now. Everyone that's represented on a painting is presented as divinity. This is, of course, extremely blasphemous, and not to get into all of that, but yeah, it's very, very controversial practice. But it's also the proper way of understanding neoclassical portraits, and it's a proper way of understanding Romanesque drawings, mostly frescoes and icons. So this idea that we represent things as simple because they are important, because they're otherworldly. We focus on what's important in a drawing. And some of these stylizations may appear as childlike only at the first glance. If you look at them a bit better, you will see that they're incredibly well done. So we have a very banal idea of drawing, of skill, if we see this as childlike. Now, why am I talking about this? Because working as a tour guide. I saw many people talking about this, reading through many of art history books. I saw many art historians writing about this in this particular manner. I don't see these as childlike at all. I see them as highly sophisticated, highly refined, and exceptionally stylized. But yeah, let's stay with that. We have this very important idea of anachronous art. This goes back to Rome. Again, everything goes back to Rome eventually. Anachronous means something that is out of its time. So let's say that if I were to write a play today, being the beginning of 2025, postmodern era, I think, and in my play I were to use the language of Shakespeare. I were to use all of the turns of phrase, this particular complexity and this particular rhythm. If I were to speak like Shakespeare today, it would be out of place, and everyone would think that there was something wrong with me, both as a person and as an author. It may be a phenomenal play, it may be as well of a made play as Shakespeare's plays were, or it can be better, but people would rightfully ask me, why do you do this? It's not the time of Shakespeare anymore. You should use the language that we use today, either when we speak or when we write plays. So I would do something out of my time. So let's say that also if I'm to make a Renaissance painting today that is as well done as all of the Renaissance paintings ever done, people would say, well, why are you doing it now? We already had the Renaissance. It had its time, it had its place. And there were reasons why that style was used in that particular context. Context has changed. There's no reason for us to use this style today. So this is what anachronous means. And most of our art really is anachronous, especially these two periods. Neoclassicism is obviously anachronous in both architecture and in painting, because again, we are going back to the idea of Rome. We're trying to invoke ideas of Rome. Romanesque, same thing. So a lot of it is anachronous, but it is also something that defines their era. All of the city of Paris is built slightly before and during the Haussmannian reconstruction to be the copy of Rome, and this is a supremely anachronous idea. You could say the same thing about city of Washington, same thing. We just accept it as such. So a lot of our art is anachronous by design and by definition. So this is something that also connects these two. Now, back to the point of both architecture and visual arts being very much about impressing, about invoking the sense of awe. It doesn't really matter if it's in a religious or a secular manner that they're supposed to invoke awe. Even if it's the secular, meaning neoclassical, we see that there's a lot of religious present into it, so it's not entirely clear that secularism is far from being how should I put this, accurate and strict. Yes. So we have this whole idea of monumentality, of mass, of imposition. So when we're looking at neoclassical paintings and neoclassical buildings, we see them as very thorough, as very imposing. There is something very strong in the simplicity they invoke. Same thing with Romanesque churches, especially if you see them made in Italy. A lot of them are very, very large and extremely stern, and this provokes a certain impression. So it really is successful, I would say, in this idea that it imposes itself and that it invokes power, it invokes strength, awe, fear, and respect. So both of these styles are focused on what I would approximatively call the Ionian principle, named after the Ionian pillar that is the simplest, the most robust, the most imposing of the three famous Greek pillar styles. So it's this idea that you impose yourself, you make a power move, you make a power statement. You want to be like the Romans were. Romans were quite famous for being not only powerful, but being extremely direct about that and having no qualms about presenting their power. Romans were not necessarily terribly well acquainted with the notion of humility or irony or taking things in stride. No, they were all about power and portraying that power. This was seen as a virtuous behavior for them. We also have this idea that in itself is connected to the notion of power, and that's again connected to Rome, that this is the first pan-European style, Romanesque, we're talking about. So the style that happened in different European countries and different European cultures in a way. So, when we're talking about, let's say, the Renaissance, we somehow automatically assume that it's Italian because it came from Italy and this is where it was most successful. Though, of course, we have Renaissance in other countries too. Italian one seems to be the most important. If we're talking about Gothic style, again, we're talking about something French. It came from France. We do have Gothic buildings, mostly churches, in other countries too. But the French Gothic style is really the most important one. So we have these styles that are connected to certain countries, to certain cultures. Impressionism, again, is a very good example. We do have Impressionism pretty much all over the world, but French Impressionism is the most important one. We don't really argue about this a lot. We accept it as axiomatic truth. When we were talking about Romanesque style, we were truly talking about pan-European style and the first of its kind. Neoclassicism too was pan-European. It started from Italy. It took roots most importantly and most deeply, I would say, in France. But we know that it exists in the United States to this day. It exists in England. It exists in many other places. So we are talking about the French incarnation of neoclassicism because politically, possibly, it's the most important one on account of the French Revolution. But we are talking in both of these cases about pan-European and sometimes even global styles. And this also has to do with Rome because Rome was an empire and it expanded and it sought to consume pretty much the world. It sought to impose itself as a global presence, as a global force. And if you think about the expansion of the Roman Empire, truly they were mostly limited by geography. They could not expand any more than they have because they could not go south of the Sahara Desert. They could not cross north of Africa, so they stayed in north of Africa. They didn't see the point of going past Hadrian Walls into Scotland because it just didn't make sense. There was not much to conquer there. Although the Scottish people would tell you that's because they were so strong and indomitable that it was impossible to take over them. And they were also limited by the Rhine River. And of course then by the Middle East or Western Asia, whichever you want to call it. So you could say that had Rome had the capacity or the interest to discover new worlds like people in the 15th century had, they would probably seek to take those worlds as well. So the idea is that of expansion, is that of connection, and also this pan-European idea that the idea of both the Roman Republic and the Empire is the idea of Europe. So something that connects all of Europe together. Now, today we have the entity, the political entity that's called the European Union. You're all familiar with this, and it's basically an elaboration of the Roman idea, this notion that we should connect Europe together, we should bring it together, make it a singular entity, that was carried in church affairs and then in artistic affairs before they sought to implement that idea politically. So we could say that Neoclassicism as well as Romanesque style spoke of a unified Europe. And this is a very important thing because obviously we see political implications of this, be they good or bad. So next to this particular notion, that of constant expansion, that of constant integration of new territories, is of course the idea of colonialism. And this is something that is incredibly important for the late 18th century, for the 19th century, and the early 20th century. It is something that has a lot to do with neoclassicism and neoclassical aesthetics. And this is something that we don't talk about nearly enough. The fact that France, well, at the time, we're talking about the French Revolution in the 19th and the early 20th century, first half of the 20th century, is a very important colonial power, and that their culture is incredibly influenced and thoroughly defined by colonialism. We cannot properly understand France in any aspect of their existence if we're not talking about colonialism, or at least if we're talking about the France in the previous 500 years. So the France that is colonial has very little to do with France that is pre-colonial. So we have this idea that one of the many aspects of Rome that we are trying to mimic is the idea of a colonial empire. Now, how does this translate to Romanesque style? Because it makes perfect sense when we're talking about the 18th and the 19th century. Really, no further explanations are needed. But how does it connect to Romanesque style? Well, it really does, because this is the period of the First Crusades. And according to Hans Kohn and Edward Said and many other people, we have the Crusades act as the first colonial attempt, the first attempted colonialization, if you will, from Western Europe. This is the first attempt of Europe to expand itself, to conquer territories that are outside of Europe. So to act in a way as Romans have acted back in the day. Now, of course, this all depends how you want to regard the affair. You can be religiously inspired and spiritual, or you can be cynical, down to earth, materialistic. So you can either say that the Crusades were about liberating the tomb of Jesus, and that they had this religious goal in mind, that they were all about Christianity, they were all about bringing the Holy Land back into Christian hands. Therefore, you could argue that they were because of that, or you could be more geopolitically and historically cynical, and you could say that it was really all about controlling that incredibly important patch of land that is the key point in the Silk Road, and that is the point that controls 3 continents, basically, because it's where the 3 continents meet. Because if you control this patch of land that we call the Holy Land, you really are controlling a lot of the trade, a lot of the communication and trade routes that happens between Africa, Europe, and Asia. So this is one of the reasons why there were wars in that particular part of the world for the previous, arguably, 3,000 years, because it's so incredibly important economically. And you, again, may be cynical or spiritual about this. You could say that it was always all about economy and money, or you can say that we waged war for the Holy Land because it's the Holy Land, and whoever controls it has this proximity to God conquered or acquired, if you will. The fact is that you could say that Crusaders made considerable monetary gains from the entire affair, and you could say that this was a very important project. We had more than one crusade, so people of Europe persisted for a good number of decades in this endeavor. So you could argue that colonialism was present even in this time. And that you could argue that it brought about all the good and the bad things that happen with colonialism, that the bad things would, of course, be mass murders, entire exterminations, sacking of cities, some of them incredibly old, some of them incredibly wealthy, destruction of entire societies and civilizations. So this is obviously a bad thing. The good thing, however, would be meeting and crossbreeding of different cultures, would be exchanging a lot of knowledge, a lot of wisdom, exchanging a lot of influences. In this particular case, it was mostly the European people, the Crusaders, that got influenced by the superior culture that they stumbled upon. So they took from the Middle East much more than they brought to it. And there are very few people that would argue this, especially back in the day, especially if we're talking about the 11th and the 12th century later. So it's this idea of Europe as the main colonizing force in the 11th and then later 12th century that can be compared and should be compared, and that we are comparing to Europe as the main colonial force of the 18th, 19th, and the 20th century. So we see this particular style as a representation of that aspect of European culture too. So when we're talking about Romanesque style, we're not just talking about the church in its business that is worshipping of God and all things holy, and basically acting as mediator between humanity and God. This is what the Catholic Church does. So we are also talking about colonial expansion. We are talking about the very famous motto of the Crusaders, Deus vult, which means God wills it. So God himself said, you should go and colonize, go forth and claim Jerusalem. Or at least so how people thought back in the day. So you could say that the church itself, as an institution, had a keen interest in this colonial project happening. And you could also say that the same thing was true in the period of Neoclassicism. So you could say that the church also had an interest in colonizing the rest of the world, especially the Catholic Church. We see that the Catholic Church has presence all over former colonies of the world. We called South America Latin America for a very specific reason. We have a lot of Catholics present in Africa, in Asia, in parts of the world where you would not necessarily expect the Catholics. But there they are, and it has to do with the very foundational element of the Catholic Church, which is to be the expansion, to be the extension of the Roman Empire and to adopt politics of Rome. So it is important for us when we are looking at Romanesque frescoes, at Romanesque drawings and paintings, to think about this aspect too. To think about the very inspiration to go forth and liberate the tomb of Christ in this aspect too. So these paintings speak of a period that was driven by these ideas. It was not just a period that was driven by religious zeal. It was not driven by the desire to get closer to God, to learn more, to purify it and expand one's spirit. It really had to do with expanding its territories too and accruing one's wealth as well. And again, there's no need to explain this when it comes to neoclassical period, because we know that it was very, very colonial. But when we get to the Romanesque period, we oftentimes forget that this too was very colonial. So when we are looking at these, we need to think of these things and we need to bring them together. I would also like to make a connection between this whole idea of drawing, that we think that Romanesque people didn't really draw properly, whereas the neoclassical people drew incredibly well. I think they were both masters of stylization, masters of deformation, and of basically simplifying to the very core. This is the concept that will help us understand both of these styles. They're all about simplicity. And this is something that is incredibly influential for later periods that we're also going to be discussing in this series when we get to talk about expressionism, fauvism, optical art, neo-impressionism that we also call pointillism. We will see that this tendency to simplify is incredibly important. It truly defines the modern art. It truly defines almost the entirety of the 20th century. So it first came with this tendency, both in Romanesque and in neoclassical periods. I see now that I have depassed an hour, and this is regretfully so, but I really need to finish with the concept of the Grand Tour. This is something that has to be mentioned. Sorry, it's going to take another couple of minutes. The Grand Tour is this idea that was very popular in, again, you guessed it, 18th and 19th century, that started becoming less popular with global modes of transportation becoming available. And it was basically the idea that you would have to go to a tour of Europe, mostly Italy, parts of it France, and you would have to go to see the great monuments of antiquity. So this was, of course, mostly done by wealthy people, by wealthy youth, people who finished their education and took a year, or sometimes a couple of years, to visit these great ruins of antiquity in Italy and Greece and other such places. This was a very, very important affair, rite of passage, if you will, in one's education, and an important status symbol, of course. So the Grand Tour had to do with, well, of course, tourism, as the name would suggest, and there's a very strong link to be made between tourism that, I deal with and pilgrimage, because we have tourism existing in medieval period, when we're talking about Romanesque and later Gothic. We just don't call it that. We call it pilgrimage. This idea that you will cross great distances so as to see one item, to be in its presence. This is very much the same thing that both tourists and the pilgrims are doing. Now, we do call pilgrimage religious tourism. Nowadays, I think it's the other way around. I think we should call tourism secular pilgrimage. And I think this, I made this, how should I say, opinion acting as a tour guide, having seen people stand in line for hours on end so that they could be in the vicinity of one painting or one statue, or they are standing in line so they could get inside one building. There is truly a religious zeal, although they do not see it as such, behind this all. So this idea that you will spend a lot of money, that you will sometimes save so that you can make this one fateful journey, is something that has a lot of religious zeal in it. Not all tourists are wealthy people. Not all of them can travel to Europe on a whim. Some of them truly save for years, sometimes their entire lives, so that they could come and see something that's terribly important. And this is exactly the same what happened in the medieval period. You would save up your entire life sometimes so that you could go and make pilgrimage to a very important church so that you could be in the presence of a very important relic, or that so that you could go and do a pilgrimage that is very physically demanding, like Camino de Santiago, or if you were to visit Lourdes of Saint Teresa of Lisieux, or Mont Saint Michel, or many other pilgrimage sites. So people prepare for these. They go through strenuous physical efforts. So it's really something that I would compare to tourism of not necessarily today, I mean increasingly so today, but just the modern industrial period. There's much more to be said about the consolidation of Europe and the Grand Tour, this whole political idea of pan-European artistic movements, and how these movements vehicle a lot of political ideas. We'll explore this in some other lectures. Thanks for your attention. Have a nice day and see you soon. Ciao.